Well, that was a wonderful introduction. I thank you very much for it, Professor Jones. And I also thank you, Lisa Moore, as well as our various sponsors for making possible this glowing event. I also congratulate Tom Cable on a distinguished and illustrious career and also on your retirement. I wore this tie in your honor. This is, by the way, my first visit to the University of Texas, and I'm very grateful to be invited to what seems to be as vibrant and enterprising a scholarly community, an educational community, as I have ever come across. The enthusiasm for literature and for poetry in particular has been like a jolt to my senses. I was telling this to Professor Jones earlier this morning. In some quarters of the academy, poetry is almost passé. What we call theory is a noble beast that seems to want to feast almost exclusively on fiction among the literary arts, but poetry refuses to go away. Samuel Johnson said famously that he who is tired of London is tired of life. I ventured the opinion that he or she who is tired of poetry is probably tired of literature and language and thought, perhaps without quite knowing it. Incidentally, I'm sorry if you missed the presentation earlier today at 3 o'clock by a wonderful panel of scholars, Roger Reeves, Gershon Avilés, Leslie Wheeler, Keith Leonard, and also Alden Nielsen. My talk is somewhat more pedestrian than what they offered, but it is what it is, and I must go on with it. About poetry, every art is demanding, every art wants blood, but poetry, seen by some people, a few people, as close to frivolousness or frivolity as any art can get at times, is in many ways the most exacting. It might be the loneliest of the arts also, especially when one thinks of the almost unrelenting interiority, if there's such a word, of poetry as we practice it today as often as not. So it was even in the age of neoclassicism, if we are to judge by Alexander Pope's epistle to Dr. Arbuthnot, which is one of my favorite poems, where the poet asks, as you will recall, "Why did I write? What sin to me unknown dipped me in ink, my parents' or my own? As yet a child, nor yet a fool to fame, I lisped in numbers, for the numbers came. I left no calling for this idle trade, no duty broke, no father disobeyed. The muse but served to ease some friend, not wife, to help me through this long disease, my life." Wonderful, wonderful poem, underscoring the loneliness of the art of poetry. The genial Langston Hughes also knew the price of making poetry. "What is poetry?" Hughes asked rhetorically around 1964. He answered, "It is the human soul entire, squeezed like a lemon or a lime, drop by drop into atomic words." And what about the poet in the world of action, including political action? "A poet is a human being," Hughes continued. "Each human being must live within his time, with and for his people, and within the boundaries of his country. Therefore, how can a poet keep out of politics?" But, Hughes went on, "Be warned. Politics in any country in the world is dangerous. For the poet, politics in any country in the world had better be disguised as poetry. Politics can be the graveyard of the poet, and only poetry can be his resurrection." Finally, this injunction from Hughes to the poet: "Hang yourself, poet, in your own words, otherwise you are dead." African American poetry began, to all intents and purposes, with the improbable appearance in 1773 in London of poems on various subjects, religious and moral, by Phyllis Wheatley, Negro servant to Mr. John Wheatley of Boston in New England. From one point of view, this was a minor event. From another perspective, it was historic. The event was minor in that poems on various subjects follows somewhat mechanically the values and practices of British literary masters of the age. In addition, the presence of several occasional pieces set in New England added to its air of provincialism. But poems on various subjects also broke new ground. Only the second book of verse published by an American woman following the English-born Anne Bradstreet's achievement a century before, it posed a serious challenge to key assumptions most white people held at that time about the mental and cultural capacity of blacks. Accordingly, poems on various subjects included an affidavit from 18 eminent white men of Boston, including John Hancock himself, attesting to the fact that, mirabile dictu, the volume was the work of, quote, Phyllis, a young Negro girl. In other words, they had grilled her and she had passed the test. These men enacted the skepticism, crippling at its worst, bracing at its best, with which white America regarded, and to some extent, in some places, still regards the black poet. In turn, Wheatley anticipated, if mainly in symbolic ways, some of the basic abiding concerns of black poets to come. In her verse, she recorded both her discomfort with her identity as a black American, one born in Africa, and also her determination to succeed as an artist. In poems such as To the University of Cambridge in New England and On Being Brought from Africa to America, she contests the prevailing belief that blacks were essentially worthless except as chattel slaves. Pagan Africa, she conceded, was indeed, quote, the land of errors and Egyptian gloom, but Christianity gave blacks a chance at divine redemption, even if it required slavery to make deliverance possible. So too, in the secular sphere, she knew that publishing poetry enhanced the standing of blacks at a time when they had virtually no power. Her poems showed the world that blacks, including slaves or servants, deserved far more than white society allowed them. In fact, Wheatley's prestige as a poet enabled her in 1776 to visit and be cordially received by General George Washington, whom she eulogized in a poem at his encampment near Boston. Finally, in addressing certain poems to other blacks, including to S.M., a young African painter, on seeing his works, Wheatley also revealed a hunger for communion and community with other blacks based on a race pride that spoke to the insecurity and loneliness that marked and would continue to mark the lives of many black poets in America. By the time she died in 1784, Wheatley was all but forgotten. White intellectuals certainly thought little of her work. As part of a sweeping indictment of the quality of black life, Thomas Jefferson dismissed her poetry as below criticism. After Wheatley, a thin line of writers kept the idea of the black poet alive. In North Carolina, George Moses Horton, a slave allowed unusual freedom, became the first black explicitly to attack slavery in verse, although most of his poems are perhaps trite from a severe point of view. In publishing 3 volumes of verse, including his first, The Hope of Liberty, in 1829, and the perhaps misleadingly titled Naked Genius in 1865, Horton saw his career overlap with the rise of incendiary abolitionism, even if his poetry failed to catch the transforming fire of that movement. Not so, however, with 2 other notable black poets of this time. In 1853, when James M. Whitfield published America and Other Poems, his piece America denounced his nation as a land, quote, of blood, crime, and wrong. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper's Poems on Miscellaneous Subjects, appearing the following year, endorsed by the abolitionist zealot William Lloyd Garrison, protested the treatment of black women in particular. Poems such as The Slave Mother, didactic and sentimental, but invaluable as propaganda, enabled Harper to maintain a long career in service to civil rights, through poetry, fiction, and journalism that was especially bold in its attacks on lynching towards the end of the century. It seems safe to say that 19th century black poets, including Whitfield and Harper, who started out in the antebellum years, fell short of the achievement of the authors of prose slave narratives. This relatively novel form not only fueled abolitionist fervor, as in the impact of Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American slave written by himself, but also achieved a measure of genuine literary distinction. The slave narrative would shape the African-American novel just as it directly shaped Harriet Beecher Stowe's great Uncle Tom's Cabin. However, the slave narrative movement seemed to have little effect on black poetry. Nor were black poets of the age moved by Walt Whitman's iconoclastic Leaves of Grass of 1855. Most, like their white counterparts, held to old-fashioned notions about the ideal form and content of verse. Black poetry produced a Whitman, but one in name only. Albury A. Whitman of Springfield, Ohio, was a gifted and prolific lyricist who seemed to model his art on the standards of Longfellow above all. After the Civil War, far from growing with their new freedom, black poets seemed to enter the doldrums. Now, that period of stagnation ended with the arrival of Paul Laurence Dunbar of Ohio. Dunbar became the first black poet to gain a national audience. He also became a treasure among black Americans because of his loving, vivid portraits of black life. Dunbar seized on two major literary trends. One was the so-called plantation tradition, in which romantic notions about slavery, including myths about kind masters and mistresses and their happy darkies, helped white Americans to close the book on the Civil War. The other trend was the vogue of American regionalism, with a keen interest in dialects. Both were epitomized, satirically really at its core, by Mark Twain's Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and in poetry by the verse of James Whitcomb Riley of Indiana, who exerted a strong influence on Dunbar. With his collections Oak and Ivy, Majors and Minors, and the best-selling Lyrics of Lowly Life of 1896, for which William Dean Howells, the distinguished novelist and critic and editor, wrote an introduction, Dunbar became renowned both for dialect poems about black life and also for poems written in standard English on more elevated, putatively universal themes. Eventually, or perhaps from early on, who knows, the tension between these two areas began to demoralize him. When Howells declared in his artful introduction a distinct preference for Dunbar's dialect verse, which he saw as capturing the true range of the black sensibility, that is, between the limited poles of appetite on the one hand and emotion on the other, Dunbar mourned his faith as a black poet. His short piece, The Poet, bears his anguish over the fact that despite his labors to write poems on universal themes, especially the theme of love, in cultivated language, the world thoughtlessly, perhaps cruelly, quote, turned to praise a jingle in a broken tongue. We may ask, was Howells right in his judgment, if for the wrong reasons? Dialect verse came to dominate black poetry, just as the plantation tradition turned black life and culture into caricature. The stark irony was that the plantation tradition and the vogue of dialect verse coincided with the legalization of Jim Crow in America, especially through the 1896 U.S. Supreme Court decision in Plessy versus Ferguson, upholding racial segregation in public transportation. Black poets were aware of this irony. Dunbar's friend James D. Carruthers, who also excelled at the form, makes clear in his poem At the Closed Gate of Justice his anguish that, quote, to be a Negro in a day like this demands forgiveness. As with Dunbar, however, writing dialect verse made Carruthers' reputation as a poet. Century and other leading white magazines published his work. Nevertheless, the tension between dialect and standard English persisted, as may be seen in any comparison of Carruthers' amusing dialect piece, Me and Dunbar, with his formal elegy of 1912, Paul Laurence Dunbar. But dialect verse, that is, dialect verse as sponsored mainly by the plantation tradition, based on benign views of slavery, was doomed. It did not survive far into the new century, especially as anti-black repression, epitomized by the brazen lynching of blacks in the South, intensified, and as black resistance grew. The militancy of intellectuals such as W.B. Du Bois played a strong role in its demise. In The Souls of Black Folk, a landmark prose text that helped to define modern African-American character and psychology, Du Bois electrified black thinkers and artists with his depiction of a dramatic double consciousness as innate to black life. And forgive me for reading the quotation, but because it is probably the most often cited passage in African-American cultural criticism. He identified the key quality of the African-American as his or her two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. Du Bois published only a few of his poems, but work such as his fierce, almost apoplectic A Litany of Atlanta following the anti-black Atlanta riot of 1906 and The Song of the Smoke were free verse protests that helped to destabilize the hold exerted by dialect and plantation caricatures on the forms and functions of black poetry. Other poets of this period contested dialect in different ways. William Stanley Braithwaite, a starchy black Bostonian who became nationally respected as the editor of more than 30 anthologies of verse, including an annual anthology of American magazine verse, admired Dunbar as a poet. Nevertheless, his first volume, Lyrics of Life and Love, following closely on one of Dunbar's own titles, showed his kindred or perhaps superior devotion to the major English romantic and neo-romantic poets, whose work indeed inspired most black American poets of the age. Seeking to be modern, Braithwaite also absorbed the influence of contemporary American writers such as Edwin Arlington Robinson. However, the result was charming, gently moving, or perplexing, often expertly written verse that, in avoiding the subjects of race and social justice, I would say, sacrificed blood and sinew. Fenton Johnson of Chicago, who published 3 collections of verse, including Visions of the Dusk and Songs of the Soil, also admired Dunbar. With the trauma of World War I, however, he became perhaps the first black American to follow a recognized version of aesthetic modernism. Familiar with Harriet Monroe's Chicago-based poetry magazine and thus exposed to the esoteric work of Eliot and Pound, he hewed instead to the populist line of modernism preferred by Edgar Lee Masters and Carl Sandburg. Johnson's poems in this vein, lamenting the effects of civilization in a sometimes cynical tone, helped to finish off traditional dialect verse among the more promising young black poets. Another key poet in this transitional period around World War I was Claude McKay. In his native Jamaica, inspired largely by Dunbar, almost certainly, and despite his own wide reading, he had published 2 volumes of dialect verse. Moving to New York, however, he fell in with modernist literary leaders such as E.A. Robinson, Waldo Frank, and Floyd Dell. McKay became an editor of Dell's Liberator magazine, which was quite an achievement for an African American or a black man or black woman in America at the time. He abandoned dialect. His volumes Spring in New Hampshire and Harlem Shadows show off his lyric facility, but in explosive sonnets, and he believed very strongly in the form, such as If We Must Die, White House, To the White Fiends, and America, he also vented his rage against American racism and hypocrisy. If We Must Die, written following the particularly bloody anti-black Chicago riots of 1919, electrified aspiring black poets and became his signature piece. McKay set new standards of verse as a vehicle for black protest, although If We Must Die itself makes no specific mention of race, nation, or politics, and McKay, in fact, later denied that it had anything to do with race at all. Finally, in some respects, the most important transitional figure was the poet, novelist, diplomat, and NAACP leader James Weldon Johnson, a Floridian settled in New York City. In his key anthology of 1923, The Book of American Negro Poetry, Johnson pronounced dialect verse dead. Later, in his autobiography Along This Way, he would credit his own rejection of the form to a belated but shattering reading of Whitman's Leaves of Grass. The impact on his own work was mixed. He published several stately poems in standard English in praise of African American history and culture. His best-known pieces are probably O Black and Unknown Bards, about the composers of the Black spirituals, and undoubtedly the text of Lift Every Voice and Sing, the so-called Black American national anthem. But Johnson understood the higher aims of the best dialect poets, even if he no longer wished to be one. In 1927, when his book of free verse, God's Trombones, offered 7 sermons as delivered by old-time black preachers, he sought to capture, especially in The Creation, a sermon which is based on Genesis, the rhetorical and rhythmic virtuosity of the untutored black sermonic tradition without recourse to the traditional markers of black illiteracy. In the early years of the so-called Harlem Renaissance, which spanned most of the 1920s and the early 1930s, poetry played a decisive role. Replacing the tension between standard English and dialect verse was a kindred clash between a devotion to traditional notions about poetry and a contrarian passion for black mass culture. This clash played itself out most dramatically, I would say, in the contrast between the work of County Cullen, Cullen was born in 1903, and Langston Hughes, born a year earlier. Adoring the English poets John Keats, as in his poem To John Keats, Poet at Springtime, and A.E. Housman, Cullen saw the language of lower-class urban black culture as hostile to true poetry. He loved jazz, but he would not use it in his poetry. He also nursed a mournful sense of his identity as a black poet, as his title, The Shroud of Color, suggests. His sonnet, Yet Do I Marvel, ends with the speaker marveling that an inscrutable God should have done, quote, this curious thing, to make a poet black and bid him sing. The sense of a self-destructive conflict between being black and being also American haunts probably his major poem, Heritage, one that begins, What is Africa to me? Copper Sun and Scarlet Sea. This poem also hints at its persona's possibly conflicted sexuality, but the themes of gayness, lesbianism, and bisexuality were topics very few white and virtually no black poets dared to treat at that time. Later, with his first volume, Color, in 1925, Cullen established his reputation as a harbinger of a new day in black poetry, one rooted in youth and an albeit tepid version of modernity. Langston Hughes, his rival, saw poetry differently. He built his early reputation on a succession of poems, such as The Negro Speaks of Rivers, that calmly asserted the beauty, integrity, and historicity of the African American people. Such work dominates his first book, The Weary Blues, which appeared in 1926. But his second, Fine Clothes to the Jew, broke new ground with its privileging of the blues as its major influence. Condemned in the black press as seeming to endorse the semi-literate, sexually unrestrained culture of the urban black poor, the book put in place some key elements of future black verse. Above all, Hughes saw black music, especially the blues, which he had used tentatively in The Weary Blues, as the core of his mature aesthetic. Later, he recalled how he had tried to write poems shaped by black music. Quote, like the waves of the sea, he would write in The Big Sea in 1940, coming one after another, always one after another, like the earth moving around the sun, night, day, night, day, night, day, forever. So is the undertow of black music with its rhythm that never betrays you, its strength like the beat of the human heart, its humor and its rooted power. The blues emphasizes the pain of black life, but also typically features an exuberant embrace of life and a biting wit. In this way, black men and women convert pain into art. Dialect had returned to black poetry, but in a new form. Now it expressed rage and despair as well as comedy. Virtually the full range of African American life, including the range of its language, was now, in theory at least, at the disposal of black poets, even if only a few explored it. One of these few was the Howard University professor Sterling Brown. His sole volume, Southern Road, built on the blues tradition with poems such as Ma Rainey about one of the most famous of blues performers. However, most other poets of the era, the 1920s and early 1930s, and especially the women writers, stuck to the genteel. Angelina Weld Grimke and Georgia Douglas Johnson offered largely sentimental poems about love and the loss of love. And younger writers such as Anne Spencer and Helene Johnson also found it hard to surrender their respectability in their service to art. In poems such as Before the Feast of Shushan and At the Carnival, Spencer showed the keenest interest in high modernism among the Harlem Renaissance writers. A devout Christian, Arnold Rampersad created a poetry of spiritual meditation largely unprecedented in prominent black verse since the 18th century. His poem Morning at Bethesda, which links spiritual loss to the effects of the involuntary African diaspora, became one of the most admired poems of the Harlem Renaissance. A victim of the Great Economic Depression, the so-called Harlem Renaissance faded by 1931, 32, 33, into what became virtually a lost decade for African American poetry. Most of the published poets seemed to shut up shop. Hughes toiled on, but shifted from the blues to penning radical socialist propaganda poems such as Goodbye Christ and Good Morning Revolution. But four new talents in particular, Margaret Walker, those of Margaret Walker, Gwendolyn Brooks, Melville Tolson, and Robert Hayden, rose to fill the void. In 1942, Margaret Walker won a Yale University Younger Poets Award for her slender but trenchant volume For My People, with its title taken from a poem by Langston Hughes. Its title poem affirms rhythmically love and respect for the black masses, including black women. Although Walker, in a sense, did not build on this success as a poet, about the same time, Gwendolyn Brooks launched a career that would keep her near the center of black American poetry for decades to come. In her first volume, A Street in Bronzeville, published in 1945, she explored black life in a corner of Chicago where she lived most of her life. 4 years later, in 1949, she published Annie Allen, which won her a Pulitzer Prize. This was easily the most prestigious honor ever won by a black American poet or writer. Brooks offered a new fusion in African American poetry. Influenced both by writers such as Hughes and by the high modernist tradition, then epitomized perhaps by Robert Lowell, she moved as a poet between relative simplicity and, as in her poem, The Sundays of Satin Legs Smith, a complexity of prosody, learned allusion, and sustained irony that was relatively new to black American poetry. For example, the poem begins, Inamoratas, with an approbation, bestowed his title, blessed his inclination. The Sundays of Satin Legs Smith. Brooks, I imagine that at that point, with the very first two lines, some people probably closed their books very gently. Brooks brought a woman's eye, intelligence, sensibility, and life experience to her poetry. Early pieces such as Kitchenette Building, about the struggles of the poetic imagination when the writer is also a housewife struggling to make ends meet, and The Mother, about the psychological trauma of abortions, explored the reality of city life in a fashion relatively new to black poetry. Anchored in Chicago, Brooks was alert to national issues and trends. Her poetry continued to grow as that of other writers withered. Faced by the intimidating Black Power movement of the 1960s, for example, she would throw in her lot with the young and the black. If Brooks modified and domesticated some of the key techniques of high modernism, Melvin B. Tolson came to commit himself to its most arcane, esoteric, and at times, for some people, bewildering aspects. In the 1930s, he wrote a relatively conventional collection of poetic portraits of Harlem life, published some 30 years later as Harlem Gallery and A Gallery of Harlem Portraits. In 1944, his book Rendezvous with America built on the success of its best-known poem, A Dark Symphony, which is a solemn, fairly conventional paean to black achievement. However, a commission from the Liberian government to produce a long poem in honor of the centenary of the republic founded by American ex-slaves led to the most daring modernist venture in African-American poetry to that time, Libretto for the Republic of Liberia, which appeared in 1953. This volume, densely studied in almost every line with abstruse allusions and jauntily perplexing wordplay, appeared with a tribute to its author by Alan Tate, among the most authoritative critics of poetry of this era. Tate hailed Tolson as peerless in his fusion of the black experience with the complex language of modernism. The fourth member of this transitional quartet was Robert Hayden of Detroit, Michigan. Influenced by his deep reading in historical material as part of the Federal Writers' Project of the late 1930s, Hayden published Heartshape in the Dust in 1940. His career then took a fortuitous turn when, as a graduate student at the University of Michigan, he studied with W.H. Auden, a visiting professor, and of course, an extraordinary British/American poet. Hayden's views about poetry and history began to mature. Shaped also by the pacifist universalism of his Baha'i faith, he brought a visionary quality to his meditations on race, history, and everyday life. His best work includes finely wrought and yet viscerally powerful poems about slavery, such as Middle Passage and Runagate, Runagate. Later, he applied a perhaps even more refined moral and artistic consciousness in writing poems about contemporary life, such as the elegy El Hajj Malik el-Shabazz, about the assassinated leader Malcolm X's spiritual evolution. His mastery as a writer may be seen clearly in his late volumes The Night Blooming Sirius in 1972 and Angle of Ascent, New and Selected Poems in 1975. In 1976, when the Library of Congress appointed him its consultant in poetry, Hayden became the first African American to hold that annual and rather distinguished position. By this time, however, almost all the older writers, including Hayden, were under fire from militant younger blacks inspired starting around 1965 by the Black Power movement and, hard on its heels, the Black Arts movement. Both movements preached a radical, exclusionary version of black identity with pronounced hostility towards Euro-American white culture. The leader in the arts was no doubt the poet, dramatist, and editor Amiri Baraka, who changed his name from Leroy Jones to emphasize his African nationalist identity. Once a disciple of the Beat movement, Baraka, as Leroy Jones, had lived with his white wife and their children in Greenwich Village, New York, where he and his wife edited an important beat arts journal. His first book of poetry, prefaced to a 20-volume suicide note, which appeared in 1961, exposes a charming, sometimes whimsical sensibility, fortified by a keen intelligence and a studied interest in popular culture and formal experimentation. However, after the death of Malcolm X in 1965, Jones severed these ties and moved to Harlem. There he sought to establish a repertory company based on black arts principles. Now he wrote a far more aggressive kind of poetry, indebted in matters of form to some extent to William Carlos Williams and to the beat master Allen Ginsberg, as well as to the disruptive modern music of jazz performers such as John Coltrane. Baraka demanded a new poetry of ruthless militancy, poems, quote, that kill. In addition to whites, he targeted the many blacks who, in his opinion, were too cowardly or misguided to purge themselves of their fatal affection for white culture. His manifesto poem, Black Art, laced with obscene words and images of violence and degradation, offers an almost apocalyptic view of American race relations and the role of the poet. His poetry of this period is featured in his book, Black Magic, Poetry, Black Magic, rather, Poetry, 1961 to 1967. In the black community, poetry exploded in popularity. Seldom, if ever, and I would say really never, in American history had this art form, poetry, so deeply infiltrated a major social movement. The Chicago-based poet Don L. Lee saw his slender volume, Don't Cry, Scream, published in 1969 by his own Third World Press, sell about 100,000 copies without the benefit of systematic publicity. Other slender volumes with a similar agenda, the assertion of black rage and independence from whites, for the most part, I would say, were almost greedily consumed by a mass readership hungry for the militancy of the Black Power and Black Arts movements. The major publisher of such volumes, often in cheap paperback form, was the astute editor Dudley Randall's Broadside Press of Detroit. Established white presses, once indifferent to, if not somewhat contemptuous of, the work of black writers, began to court them. For a while, the similarities between the poets seemed more prominent than their differences, but the differences existed. A loud choir chanted almost exclusively, or so it appeared to some people erroneously, about rage, white injustice and oppression, and the need for black solidarity, resistance, and even revenge. But the seeming hegemony of the black arts movement slowly gave way to the individualism that I suppose is necessary for the growth of art. The conversion of Amiri Baraka from black nationalism to Marxism, Leninism, Maoism epitomized the desire and capacity of the younger poets for growth and further change. Pride in black culture and their black selves was emphatically not a negotiable item now, but these poets increasingly offered work shaped more by their individual integrity and individual experience than by political ideology or rage. Key aspects of the school of confessional poetry, with its emphasis on individualism and perhaps psychology, blended in their approach to poetry with the techniques encouraged by Baraka's earlier example. The new poets emerging over a relatively short period, it included Alice Walker, Wanda Coleman, Marie Evans, Etheridge Knight, Audre Lorde, June Jordan, Clarence Major, Ishmael Reed, Michael S. Harper, Jane Cortez, Lucille Clifton, and Carolyn Rogers. Each one of these proved to be prolific, and some, such as Walker, Lorde, Major, and Reed, excelled also in fiction and autobiography. Almost all wrote free verse only. Rhyme and tight constricting forms, such as the sonnet, seemed obsolete and perhaps symptomatic of cultural treachery. Nevertheless, variety abounded in the new poetry. If street language and styles were important to poets such as Sonia Sanchez and Jane Cortez, others aimed for a more modest infusion of the vernacular. The iconoclastic Reed helped to take black poetry and fiction toward postmodernism, and he was not the only one to do so, although it was not necessarily acknowledged at the time. June Jordan's progressive politics, less dogmatic than Baraka's, but no less trenchant, offered an implicit critique of black cultural nationalism, especially extreme cultural nationalism. So too did the now broadening vistas of the younger African-American poet. Gender became a major line of division as black nationalism morphed and matured. Building unconsciously, perhaps, to some extent, on Gwendolyn Brooks's foundation, black women poets began to explore the variegated territory of feminism. In contesting the dominance of males, which many women apparently had accepted, sometimes meekly, in a more militant era, or the height of the militancy, women poets helped to change the face of the new black poetry. The same unspoken tension would result in fiction in the material ascendancy of novelists such as Alice Walker, Gloria Naylor, Terry McMillan, and Toni Morrison over their male counterparts. The tension over gender also figured in 1975 in the extraordinary stage success of the poet Ntozake Shange's verse play for colored girls who have considered suicide when the rainbow is enough. The relative freedom of gay men and women to express pride in their sexuality, but more importantly, to explore its social, political, cultural, and psychological dimensions, surfaced first, I would say, among women writers, perhaps among Audre Lorde, notably. Later, excruciatingly attended by the rise of the AIDS epidemic of the late 1980s and the 1990s, came the work of black male poets such as Essex Hemphill and Melvin Dixon. An activist on behalf of gay rights, as well as an essayist, Hemphill published some of his most important poems in Conditions, which appeared in 1986. The poetry of Dixon, a novelist and a fine trained professor of literature, may be found in his posthumously published Love's Instruments, which appeared in 1995. In retrospect, however, as we look at the growth and of the new African American poetry and its development of roots that would outlast incidental bouts and incidental travails and challenges. In retrospect, probably nothing underwrote the lives and careers of the new black poets and assured the entrenchment of black American poetry as much as did the appointment of the better writers, in most cases, not in every cases, to niches in colleges and universities as teachers of creative writing or black literary studies. Ironically, the English department, I don't mean this one, I mean the English department in general, the English department, once a bastion of racial reaction and general ultra-conservatism, would be the savior, or depending on the way you look at it, could be seen as the Trojan horse, that would facilitate the establishment of the black presence such as it is in American universities. Virginia Woolf had called once for women to have a room of one's own, a room in which to write. The modern equivalent is a college or university slot. These jobs, guaranteeing financial security in a typically liberal or at least tolerant setting, were part of the historic post-World War II growth of creative writing as a field in American colleges and universities. They were also a crucial result, crucial at least for poetry, of the wrenching but monumental changes that the civil rights struggle brought to historically white schools. Instead of the economic scuffling that had afflicted black Americans as a whole over the centuries, the more successful black poets finally had a room of their own in a house, the university, in which arts and artists are generally respected and even honored. Over the most recent generation, African American poets, some of them veterans from the 1960s, others born at that time, have shown that the line begun so tentatively in such lonely fashion with Phyllis Wheatley has come to a kind of fruition. They continue to win honors and awards that reflect the fact that with their work anchored in their people's varied culture, black American poetry has certainly come of age. As a body, these poets possess intellectual and emotional depth to match their technical skills. Rita Dove, born in 1952, not only won the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry for her third published collection, Thomas and Beulah, published in 1986, but has also served as Poet Laureate of the United States from 93 to 95. Yusef Komunyakaa won the Pulitzer Prize for Poetry in 1994 for his volume Leon Vernacular. He has also served as Chancellor of the Academy of American Poets. From an earlier generation, Lucille Clifton, her first collection appeared in 1969. She won the National Book Award in 2000 for Blessing the Boat's New and Selected Poems, 1988 to 2000. In 2007, Natasha Trethewey, who was born in 1966, won the Pulitzer Prize for Native Guard, a collection of poems about black Union soldiers in Mississippi during the Civil War. Maya Angelou recited a poem at the inauguration of President Clinton in 1992, and Elizabeth Alexander did the same when President Obama was inaugurated in 2009. Despite such honors, black poetry has resisted stagnation, has remained as vigorous as ever. About the same time, slam poetry and spoken word poetry, sinuously intertwined with the internationally successful hip-hop and rap movements, undoubtedly helped to exert a strong influence on black poets. Powered by its popularity among young people and through rap, its dissemination via radio and television, the evident virtuosity of many of these performers in their manipulation of language seemed to encourage a degree of redefinition of poetry, and in particular black poetry, even as it expanded the audience for poetry itself. The links between this pulsating, youth-driven urge to poetry and the compelling rhymes and rhythms of rap music present a clear parallel to the influence in the 1920s of the blues and jazz on poets such as Langston Hughes, as well as the influence of more experimental, ultramodernist, later jazz music on poets who came of age in the 1970s and 1980s. In all cases, the new forms met both acceptance and also resistance, or resistance until some fruitful balance was struck informally between the imperatives of the new on the one hand and the almost unfathomable hold of tradition on the most accomplished poets on the other. Helping black poets to maintain their collective equilibrium in the face of both unprecedented success and challenging change has been the institution which I think deserves to be singled out, called Cave Canem, probably the single most significant institutional force in black poetry at the turn of the century. Of course, the name comes from the Latin for beware. The name is Latin, beware of the dog, a warning sign that survived the destruction of Pompeii. Cave Canem was founded in 1996 by the poets and professors Cornelius Eady and Toy Derricott, with the avoid aim of protecting and nurturing black poets and poetry. To Derricott and Eady, black poets are still relatively few and too isolated in most universities, and black poetry remains in critical need of support despite its progress over the decades. Cornelius Eady, has spelled out his sense of the problem. In MFA or other creative writing programs, you find very quickly that you are a minority in many ways, in the physical sense, but also the cultural. There is an unspoken understanding that you're there to become someone better than who you are already, which means where you come from is bad. Suddenly you're feeling that in order to be accepted into this other group, you have to change or transform yourself. You realize no one is expected to transform or change in the way you are expected to change, and you become guarded and question why you're there. You hear all kinds of unspoken pronouncements about who you are, why you are there, where you come from, and where you're supposed to be, and you end up in discussions you feel have little to do with you as a poet. To be quite blunt, you realize some people, not all, but some, will resent the fact you're there and think you're a charity case. Why Cave Canem as an institution? Eady says, I've always carried this feeling that we really should be some place where we could do the work we need to do without having to feel like we have to explain ourselves. The work should be about poetry. It should be about the work and nothing else. Within 10 years, Cave Canem had become national in scope, with a board of directors, a regular set of programs that includes an annual summer retreat for younger poets, and perhaps most significantly, the direct or indirect support of almost every leading African-American poet. It supports both those writers based in academic institutions and those inspired or excited by more popular democratic forms, including the poetry slam. Cave Canem includes the jazz-inspired experimental poet Nathaniel Mackey of the University of Santa Cruz, Carl Phillips, whose Speak Low of 2009 was his 10th book of poetry, and who teaches classics as well as creative writing at Washington University, and I suppose you can say our own Harriet Mullen at UCLA, whose Muse and Drudge and Sleeping with the Dictionary show off her extraordinary range of influences, starting perhaps with the blues. Not surprisingly, perhaps, the consolidation of the art of poetry as practiced by Black Americans has led to a new respect for formalism, certainly a new debate about formalism, neo-formalism, and other emphases on the significance of form and tradition in poetry. Where once a kind of stigma, the smell of cultural treachery, attached itself to the work of Black writers who seemed overly devoted to questions of form, It is now expected of committed black poets, I think it's fair to say, that they should develop and exhibit a sense of a respect for formalism or versions of formalism, a respect for it, if not a strict adherence to any ism whatsoever. The central point, once again, is the obligation of such movements to respect African American reality, to reflect Black American concerns, traditions, cultural forms, and culture-anchored traditions. This dynamic view of form is reflected in the poetry of writers, almost all in some way linked or sympathetic to the aims of Cave Canem, as different as the veterans Eugene Redmond and Ed Robeson on the one hand, and younger writers such as Zafar Michael Weaver, or not so young, Larry Van Cleef Stefanon, Kevin Young, and G.S. Giscombe. Are we in a post-black period? Is the concept of African American poetry not only obsolete, but dangerous, possibly toxic? Not so long ago, a friend of mine, but that's not the pertinent matter, Professor Kenneth Warren at the University of Chicago, asked aloud for all to hear, what was African American literature? What was African American literature? Positing in that piece that the conditions, the terms and conditions that had produced African American literature have become essentially passé, and what is being written now cannot be considered African American literature, but is American literature or world literature or something other than African American literature. Should we be asking what was African American poetry? I will let Harriet Mullen have the last word, although she's not addressing this question dead on. African American poetry today might be characterized by more speculative and inclusive discussions of blackness, more nuanced attention to socioeconomic, sexual, cultural, and aesthetic differences, more expansive global consciousness. The Black Arts movement, in its time, allied itself with urgent political goals of black solidarity and empowerment. Today, there appears to be no aesthetic or political consensus of African American poets, yet I would not go so far as to say that we are post-black or that we lack political consciousness. We are still perceived as different from other Americans, although we are somewhat integrated into mainstream culture. African American poetry has shifted from declaring to interrogating blackness, expanding black experience and black expression, and representing human experience from a globally conscious black perspective. African Americans, traditional and innovative, are freely exploring divergent ideas and poetics. On such a solid and yet dynamic creative foundation, the future health of African American poetry, a form born in slavery, humiliation, timidity, and alienation, seems to me assured. Thank you.